The life of a pastor. Man, you just get pulled in so many different directions, so many conversations. So I'm late starting this video, so I apologize. I actually put, to those who subscribe to the channel, I announced that I was going to be doing this video at 11, and it is 11:51. All right, but let's have this conversation. The title of today's sort of video is why I'm not a Calvinist. All right. Before you call me a heretic, hear me out so you can understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. All right? Let me explain what I am and what's happening here. I think Calvinism is a buzzword that a lot of people are affected by and all that stuff. So we're going to talk about this in a second. But that's the title of this video, why I'm not a Calvinist. Let me explain what I mean by that. In order to help you understand sort of where I'm at right now, I want to start with my time in India. All right. So in 2004, I've been to India twice in my life, both for a few weeks at a time. And in 2004 was my first time going to India. I'd never really left the country, I don't think, until that point in time. So we were doing a missions trip at the church that I was in, and we went to a place called Visakhapatnam or Vizag. It was southeast India, right down there by the Bay of Bengal and all that stuff. It was a travel. That joint was hectic. It took us 40 hours of travel time to get to India. When I got there, I was blown away by a couple things. One, how primitive where we were it looked. I'm used to cities and suburbs and things like that in America, or even when you see where other people live in their country, you usually show like the parts that are more modern. It was very primitive where we lived, very primitive. And a lot of the work that we did with people in India, I couldn't believe it. The other thing that blew me away was the faith that people had. So I was coming from a church that would have been Calvinistic, or they would have said largely, essentially Reformed, which is Calvinism and Reformed theology are not the same thing, even though they kind of flow. Calvinism is very specific. Reformed theology is a bit more of a broader topic. It's usually associated with like covenant theology and things like that. Not all Calvinists are covenant theology people and all this stuff, right? So they're not the same thing, even though people equate Reformed theology and Calvinism. It's the same thing. So I was coming from a church that was essentially Reformed, and now I'm in a country that has no knowledge of these things. Now, for the weeks that I was there, I experienced in India the most, I would say, the purest, the most sincere faith, the most sincere power of prayer in the scriptures, miracles, healing people, doing things that were great. Listening to these people tell their stories of casting out demons and bringing people back from the dead, all this stuff. These were genuine people. And I remember one night I was sitting on a balcony at an orphanage that was highly demonic possession, highly demonic influence on this balcony. And it was late at night. Me and the guy, pastor there named John David, were there. And I asked him, hey, are you a Calvinist? And he was like, brother, what is Calvin? And I said, you don't know what Calvinism is? Or you don't know what Arminianism is? He says, no, what this, they always do this in India. They always shake their head side to side. He was like, brother, what is that? They didn't know what it was, right? So I was explaining to him. He said, no, brother, I don't know what that is, right? But I was like, man, these people have the most sincere faith and the most sincere application and practice of it. So when you're in a place for a couple of weeks and you're doing stuff, you all of a sudden it becomes normal to you. So when I eventually came back home, there were 18 of us who went the first time, and there were 16 the second time I went. The first time I came back home, I was shocked. I couldn't believe it because I had spent so much time in India around people who clearly loved God, who did all, I'm talking about their application, their reliance on prayer, all of this stuff was in nothing I'd ever seen in where I was from in America, in the DC, Maryland area. I'm not saying that there's no churches or no Christians like that. I just hadn't seen it. And when I came back, I remember being shocked. And I remember having to recalibrate and remind myself that God called me to America, not to India, because it was so sincere there. It was so pure that when I came back, everything just seemed kind of fake. Big screen and it just didn't seem real. So I came back and I realized this. Okay, I still believe my theological distinctives about God, but God is not reduced to work in the theological conceptual framework that I have. That is not the only way God works. All right. Since then, I was in a book called, written by a guy named Colin Hansen, called Young, Restless, and Reformed. Young, Restless, Reformed. And it was a book, he was at the time the editor of Christianity Today. And in '07, he was working on a book that was talking about this new Calvinist movement called Young, Restless, Reformed. And it was largely about the family of churches I was a part of, Sovereign Grace, the conference that Joshua Harris did called New Attitude. And so myself and Shai Lin, where I was being interviewed, I brought Shai Lin with me, and we're sitting in front of this guy, and he's interviewing us about Reformed theology, Calvinist, and we were Christian rap artists who largely espoused Calvinist doctrine. And so there was this movement of sort of a neo-Calvinistic movement, but it had its own vibe. Like we were, the church I was a part of, the family of churches, we were continuationists, right? So most Reformed people are cessationists. They don't necessarily believe in the supernatural gifts in the same way that like a Pentecostal or charismatic would. Many of them still believe that God can do miracles, but not giving someone a gift. Well, I was a continuationist that still believed in tongues and all these different things, and it was all of that. So after this book came out, then I started to notice that there were a lot of conflict about Calvinism. There was a lot of people saying that Calvinism is unbiblical because of its doctrine of election and things like that, right? It was unbiblical. It taught these things, and then there were other people. The Calvinists were saying, well, if you're not a Calvinist, then you don't believe sound doctrine, right? So the other side of Calvinism would be Arminianism, right? So basically the distinctives is, let me say this, what a Calvinist is. A Calvinist is someone who basically believes in the teaching of Calvin, but largely is connected to an acronym called the TULIP, right? So there's 5 points of Calvinism, and most Calvinists are either 5 points, so total depravity, unconditional election. Total depravity just means everyone is depraved in their sin totally, right? Totally, right? Just totally. Like everything about you on some level is sinful. Total depravity. Unconditional election, God, without any conditions based on anyone, chooses people to be saved, right? Limited atonement, not everyone is chosen to be saved, is elected. And so limited atonement means that some people are not going to experience atonement. Irresistible grace is the I, where when you're called by God, you cannot reject it. Like you will respond to and then P, perseverance of the saints, right? That's the 5 points of Calvinism, and some people are 5 point or 4 point. A lot of people struggle with limited atonement. So they tried to change the term to particular redemption, but then you can't call it the two-pip, right? The two-pip, nobody knows what a two-pip is. It's the two-lip, right? That makes more sense. So anyway, Calvinists, I started watching a lot of argumentation, and it was growing. It was growing to the point where like, wow, these people are really beefing with each other. And even now, today, on my Facebook wall, if I scroll, you'll see people being like, Calvinist is unbiblical, it's a heretical doctrine, it's from Satan. And then you see on the other side, man, Arminians, they don't trust the gospel, they're not saved. And again, I'm not saying everyone who's a Calvinist thinks this way, or everyone who's not a Calvinist thinks Calvinism is evil. But I've watched over time this growing animosity to what it means to be a Calvinist or what it means to be a Christian. And what it's become now, it's not even, do you believe, it's what it means to be a Christian. Calvinism has been equated. Now, people don't say this. Let me say this, because there's going to be someone watching who's a Calvinist that says, I don't think that way. Cool, but don't tell me I don't know who thinks that way. I hate when people say that. Let me tell you why. There are 8 billion people in America alone. No one knows what everyone who professes to be a Calvinist or a non-Calvinist thinks. So when I make statements, I'm talking about things I've actually seen people say, not speculate. So if you haven't seen it, that doesn't mean it's not true. I just want to put that out there because people say, I haven't heard anybody. You got 30 friends on your Facebook, fam. I got almost 5,000. I see a lot more. All right, let's you know what I'm saying. All right. So Calvinism has been equated for many people to Christianity, and then people who are against Calvinism, it's a really wild thing. I've seen this happen a lot. And let's just be honest, many of us who watch this, you've seen it too. I've seen it in Christian rap. When I came into CHH in 2005, it was like, you got to be reformed. You got to be a Calvinist. If you're not, then you're not really going to be accepted by the broader audience. And so I've seen this happen to a lot of people. So this is a reality for many Christians who look to say, I'm a Calvinist and this and that. But I never understood why there's such a strong allegiance. I mean, there were times when people would say something and be like, that's not what John Calvin said. And I was always like, so what though? Like, I mean, why? I feel like at one point, people respected John Calvin more than the Apostle John. They respected John Piper, John MacArthur. It's like, listen, if I'm going to elevate a John, it's going to be the Apostle John. I'm not elevating none of these other dudes, right? So as it started to happen, I started to look into the scriptures. Now, what I'm about to say, many people are probably expecting me to pull out doctrines that contradict Calvin. The reason why I'm not a Calvinist is not that. This is why I'm not a Calvinist, and let me explain right now. From the verses, from scripture. Let me tell you what I think has been happening. Here's what happens in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Now let me give you just a quick backdrop. Corinthians is one of 4 letters that Paul wrote. We have 2 of those letters. We have his 2nd and 4th letter, but we call them 1st and 2nd Corinthians. This was a church that Paul stayed with the longest out of any church. He was there with them almost 2 years, just under 2 years. He really loved these people. But he's writing a letter in our 1st Corinthians, his 2nd, that's going to be 95% correction for the way that they're living. Okay? So he starts off, this is Paul, by the grace of God in me, when I'm writing to you. And then in verse 4 of chapter 1 through 9, he goes through and explains why he believes that the Corinthians are genuine Christians. They have the Spirit, the gifts of the Spirit are at work and all these things, right? Sidebar. Corinthians is a largely corrective book. So if you have the fruits of the gifts of the Spirit, if you can speak in tongues, all these things, that doesn't mean you're mature, by the way. He's writing to a group of Christians that are grossly immature, and he's highlighting the way you're using the gifts are immature. The reason why I'm saying that, because many people think that the supernatural gifts, if you believe in that, are somehow a measure of maturity. They are not. All right, back to the story. So he says, I believe you're Christians in 4 through 9. And then he gets to verse 10 and he starts to question. He has some concerns. And here's what he says in verse 11. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there is quarreling among you, my brothers. Okay, listen to the language. It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there's quarreling among you, my brothers. Verse 12 of Corinthians 1. What I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Right? This is 1 Corinthians. This is the word of God. This isn't me making this up. Then he says this. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? Okay? So here's Paul's concern. He acknowledges that they're genuine believers, but you are quarreling, right? That's what he says. You are quarreling among you, my brothers. So these are fellow Christians. You're quarreling. And here's the quarrel. The quarrel is over who you're saying you bang with, who I belong to. Well, I'm with Paul. I follow Paul. Well, should I follow Apollos? Apollos was a really solid teacher. He was a really dynamic speaker. And a lot of people, Paul says in one of his later letters that they're bringing Apollos so that he can wow people with his teaching. He has a really gift of public teaching. Some people say, I'm with Apollos. Well, I follow Cephas. That's Peter, right? Well, I follow Christ. Well, what Paul is concerned is he's saying, is Christ divided? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? In other words, you are quarreling over who you are associating yourselves with. Now, here's what's important. 2 things that are important. Number 1, I don't think it stopped with that kind of association. I'm a Calvinist. Well, I'm an Arminian. Well, I'm this, I'm that. It's the same idol, different altar. Now, here's what's also important. This is a human issue. This isn't even a Christian West theological issue. This is a human condition. Paul's writing this almost 2,000, 1,500 years before Calvin and Luther and Arminius and Zwingli and all these people existed. He's writing this and he's saying, what are you doing? Why are you fighting over who you're associated with? Is Christ divided? Now, here's the other thing that you have to know. There would have been some differences in what some of them probably believed. There would have been some distinctions that are different. Peter says in his epistle that some of Paul's writings are hard to understand. Right? So there are distinctions in what they're writing, but it was the gospel was there. It was there, but it was distinctions. But Paul's concerned you're quarreling, right? He continues in 1 Corinthians 3. So that was 1 Corinthians 1, verse 11 through 13. Here we pick up 1 Corinthians 3, beginning in verse 3. Here's what he says. For you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh, behaving only in a human way? Listen to the categories he's listing. Jealousy and strife among you, are you not of the flesh, behaving in a human way? Well, what's he saying would be of the flesh and behaving in a human way? Here's what he says. This is 1 Corinthians 3, not 1 Corinthians 1. Here's what he says. For one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos. Are you not being merely human? Then he says this, 1 Corinthians 3:5. What then is Apollos? What then is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. And then he goes on to verse 6 and 7. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants nor he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. Stay with me, because this is the word of God. This isn't me. This is what God is saying. And some of you are going to be offended because you do this very thing. This is what he says. Stay with me. He says, are you not of the flesh? For while there is jealousy and strife among you, how are you of the flesh? What is the jealousy and strife he's talking about? He says, for when one says, I follow Paul, I follow Apollos, are you not merely human? So the same argument that he brings up in 1 Corinthians 1, he's bringing up in 1 Corinthians 3, and saying, you are of the flesh when you boast about who your allegiance is to. And so he said in 1 Corinthians 1, am I Christ? Did I baptize you? Baptized in the name of Paul? And he says here, what then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants of the Most High, whom you believe. Then he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So Paul's concern, this is the human condition. Paul's concern at the beginning of the church, in the church's early incubation, Paul is saying, some of you are quarreling, acting fleshly, acting worldly, because you're causing division based on whose theological framework you subscribe to. And Paul says, none of those, all of these people, it doesn't matter, because God causes the growth. So what am I getting at? Here's part of the problem. Initially, being Reformed or a Calvinist or a Lutheran or an Arminian, it was used to describe what a person believes. So people wanted to know, well, what do you believe? Oh, I'm a Calvinist. Oh, okay, so you believe what his doctrine. I'm an Arminian. Okay, it was used to describe what a person believes. But now, those terms are used to decide if a person's a believer. Now, before you say, oh, I'm a Calvinist, I don't think that way, you are not the only Calvinist. You do not know every single person. So please don't tell me that, because I'm speaking from real time situations. I've lived this. I've been in this for a long time, and I've watched people say, if you're not a Calvinist, you're not a believer. If you are a Calvinist, you're not a believer. If you're a Lutheran, all of this stuff. I've seen this happen. It used to mean, oh, this is my distinction. I'm a Calvinist, I'm an Arminian. Okay, that's what you... But now they're used to decide if a person is a believer. This is dangerous. You know why? because it's theological imposition. It's theological, it's imposing theological conviction on people. Let me prove the point. Let me prove the point, because there's always someone ready to say they don't agree with you. I don't care if you agree. Start your own YouTube channel and disagree over there. Here's what Paul says in same guy, Paul, in Romans. Here's what he says. He's talking about, Romans 14 is this passage, wonderful passage. It says, look, people are going to have different theological convictions. Who are you to judge? That's what he's saying. And he says this. One person esteems one day is better than another, while another esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. This is huge. Okay, stay with me. Stay with me. This is huge. Okay, let's be clear. When Paul is talking about one day is better than another, he's talking about the Sabbath. All right, this is every theologian, any commentary you read will tell you that he is largely, most likely talking about the Sabbath. Think about how significant the Sabbath was to the Mosaic Law. It's up there, right? In fact, the Sabbath was one of the things that Jesus and the Pharisees were fighting over, because Jesus' disciples were eating the grains off of on the Sabbath. And they were like, why do your men not wash their hands on the Sabbath, right? And Jesus said, look, Matthew 11, I am Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He's saying, look, something as theologically significant as the Sabbath, people are going to have different opinions on. So one person thinks one day is better than another, while another esteems. So one person thinks you got to have a Sabbath. This day is important. You got to. And he says the other guy thinks they're all the same. No big deal. But each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So you can be fully convinced in your mind about a theological truth, and someone else can be fully convinced that doesn't agree with that truth. And he says you got to be fully convinced in your mind. Then he says this. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. So they believe they're honoring the Lord by this, right? The one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. So both people who have different theological convictions about a serious theological issue, they disagree, and each one is giving honor to the Lord by doing so. He's not questioning the salvation of the one who thinks that you got to have a Sabbath, or the one who thinks that you shouldn't have a Sabbath. There's no question of salvation. They give thanks to God. You got to be fully convinced in your mind. So, okay, if you believe in Calvinistic doctrine, you got to be fully convinced in your mind. If you believe in this doctrine, you got to be fully convinced in your mind. Right? Then he says this in Romans 14:10. Here's the kicker. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? Or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. So here's his point. Why are you passing judgment on your brother who has a different theological conviction than you? Why are you passing judgment? You're going to stand before God and give an account. Let me tell you why that's an important statement. Because I've seen many people who profess to be Calvinists, who are not Calvinists, and they are angry, bitter, and unloving towards each other. And they honestly think that the Lord is so impressed with their theological acumen that the moral component, the loving your enemies, that he doesn't care about. These people act like, because I believe a dude who's just, as Paul said, Apollos watered, I planted, God calls it to grow. Calvin is just a dude. Luther was just a dude. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm grateful for the Reformation. And I'll talk about that in a second. But they're just dudes. They're just vessels. People act like if you disagree with something Calvin said, you're heretical. Huh? Are you serious? If you're a Calvinist and you're satanic, what? Huh? No, brothers. You're going to stand before God and give an account. Not whether or not you were a Calvinist or an Arminian, but did you love your brother? Did you love your brother? This is what's happening. This has ravaged the church. If you go on YouTube right now and you type in Calvinist unbiblical, you'll see a bunch of YouTube videos. I watched a debate a couple months ago of these 4 dudes. 2 were Calvinists and 2 were not. And they started off as trying to be cordial. Yeah, well, this is my brother and this and that. They were starting off trying to be cordial. And then all of a sudden, By the end of that video, they were yelling at each other. It was in the church. I couldn't believe it. Only thing I was mad. Here's why I was mad. I was mad because I didn't have any popcorn. I wished I had popcorn while I was watching this joint. I couldn't believe it. I hit my friend up. I said, "Bro, have you seen this debate?" And he was like, "Nah." I sent him the link. I said, "Watch this joint." These dudes are acting like the most important thing is to believe in the doctrines of John Calvin or not. I couldn't believe it. And so as I started to watch this, now I want to say this. I've never once said I was a Calvinist. Never. I've never claimed to be a Calvinist. If anything, if I were going to subscribe to someone, I'm not a, if anything, I'm going to be a Paulinist. You know why? Because Paul actually wrote scripture. Now I'm being facetious by putting this here because I'm a biblicist at the end of the day. I believe the Bible teaches some of these things. There's things that I believe that the Bible teaches, and that's that. So I'm not a Calvinist because I'm a Paulinist, if anything. If I'm going to claim a dude, I'm going to claim a Paulinist because he wrote the majority of the New Testament, right? But then if I say I'm going to claim, the Bible doesn't tell us to do that, bro. We believe in Jesus, and other people will believe in Jesus that don't even know these theological distinctions, and they're going to be in heaven. Do you mean to tell me that in Revelation 7, all those people gathering around the throne are all Calvinists? Or all those people gathering around the throne are all Arminian? Man, there's a ton of people that don't even know what that means. Godly folks. There are godlier people in India that live in destitute villages that will never hear of John Calvin, never hear of election, never hear of Jacob Arminian and free will, never hear of none of these things, prevenient grace, never hear of none of it, and they glorify God. And they'll probably have high places in heaven while all these big dog theologians that be arguing with people and building up YouTube channels on who is and who isn't a Christian be at the bottom. Be at the bottom. This is the reality. And I'm going to end with this. The Bible doesn't say you have to believe in the process of salvation. It says you have to believe in the person who provided salvation. Jesus. We believe in Jesus. The Bible does not say you have to believe that before the foundation of the world, you were chosen by God to be saved. The Bible does not say you have to believe that you were totally depraved. You don't have to believe in unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints. The Bible never says you have to believe those things to be saved. It says you don't have to believe in the process of salvation. You believe in the person of salvation. We have to believe in Jesus. Because we're all going to get some things wrong. We're all going to get some things wrong. Calvinism, Arminianism, Lutheran, mainline, Protestantism, whatever you want to call it, is not the gospel. It's not. You can get mad all you want, but show me from the scriptures. Don't show me how you feel or what Calvin said. The scriptures. These things are not the gospel. They are tools, some better than others, to help us believe and apply the gospel a little bit better. They're not the gospel, fam. There are tons of people that I met and love in India who I will see in heaven that will have never heard of John Calvin until they get there. And the Lord's not going to be like, hey, you didn't believe in election, fam. You didn't believe in you didn't believe in prevenient grace, fam. No. So what do I believe? Here's what I would say. I'm reformed. So I do respect and I submit to a great bit of the theology that came out of the Reformation. But there are some things that I don't agree with John Calvin on. So to say I'm a Calvinist, I would have to agree with everything Calvin says for the most part. And I don't. There are things I just don't agree with. I don't agree with. I think the whole conversation of free will and election, I think is dumb. I think it's dumb. Because even if you agree with free will or election, you can't get saved unless you believe in Jesus Christ anyway. You're not getting saved. You don't have, salvation is not rooted in the process of it. It's rooted in the person. So even if you don't believe in election, you still have to believe in Jesus. You still have to believe that he provided salvation. And even if you do believe that God chose you before the foundation of the world to believe in who? Jesus. not Calvin or some explanation of Jesus. And that was Paul's point. He said, man, you all are being worldly. Listen, let's go back to this real quick. This is what he said. Look at this. He said, listen to this. Are you not of the flesh, behaving only in a human way? And then he explains, for when one says, I follow Paul, I follow Apollo. So replace Paul and Apollos with Calvin and Arminian. For one says, I follow Calvin, and another, I follow Jacob Arminius. Are you not being merely human? What then is Calvin? What then is our Jacob Arminius? Servants through whom you believe, as the Lord assigned to each. Now, if you believe, well, I can't believe this doctrine, because I'm not saying you got to believe everything equally. I think, just like Romans 14 said, this is what I agree with Paul. This is what he said. One person thinks Calvin has better doctrine, while another thinks Jacob Arminius does. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. I think people who do not believe in either, they're still brothers. I know people who are godly people that have never heard of John Calvin, aren't Jacob Arminius. They just, this is what the Bible says, and I believe this. That's where I'm at. That's why I'm not a Calvinist. Because I think to say I'm a Calvinist and to identify with that is doing the exact same thing that Paul is warning the Corinthians about in 1 Corinthians 1 in chapter 3. You can disagree. I don't care. Make your own video. This is my personal conviction. And if Romans 14 is right, which it is, I'm convinced in my own mind. If I convince you, cool. If I don't, cool. I'm convinced in my own mind. I think these allegiances to these people have caused more damage to the body than I think they should have. I'm grateful for John Calvin. I'm grateful that Martin Luther put those 95 theses on the church, that Catholic Church's door on Halloween. I'm grateful. Grateful. Grateful for John Calvin. Zwingli, all these people. Grateful. But I'm not going to the mattresses for none of them. Especially, and I'm not so grateful for them that I'm willing to sin morally against those who are not grateful for them and somehow think that God is pleased with me because I just shut this brother up who's not a believer because he doesn't believe in the 5 points of Calvinism. I believe what God says in 1 John 4:20. And I'm going to read it. I'm not going to put it on the screen because I don't have it on the screen because I'm over here. I'm off the freestyle right now. I'm giving y'all the, I'm off the freestyle right now. But here's what 1 John 4:20 says. And I know about heart, but sometimes I think when you say stuff, you seem arrogant. I want to read what it says so we know this. If anyone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. He is a liar. Now here's what he does to say. I don't hate him. I just disagree with him. Fam, Jesus said if you're angry at your brother, then you've committed murder in your heart towards him. Look at the eyes. They can't handle the tooth. It says, if anyone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. For he does not love his brother. For he who does not love, I'm just spitting, I'm passionate. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he hasn't seen. And this commandment we have from him, whoever loves God must also love his brother. I've seen many who profess to be Calvin do not love people who are not Calvin. They will lie to themselves and say, no, I don't hate them. I just disagree with them. But if you call someone an unbeliever only because they disagree with a doctrinal position that's like this, now don't get me wrong. There are some things that people believe is like, fam, you way off base. I'm not saying all things are equal. I'm saying I ain't going to sin against them, and I'm not going to boast that I got good theology. Because if you're a Calvinist, let's say if you're a Calvinist, if you truly believe in Calvinism, if you truly believe that, then you have to acknowledge that the only reason why you believe what you believe is because God gave you the grace and the ability to do so. So what in the world are you boasting about it for? Why are you arguing with people who don't have something that God gave you? So even if you're right, it just means God didn't give it to them yet. How dare you boast in that? It's ridiculous to me. If you truly are a Calvinist, you should be the most humble person, humble believer in the world, because you know that everything you have and believe was given to you and chosen for you before the foundation of the world by God. By God. But what do I know? What do I know? I need to drink water and eat a salad. What do I know? I'm just an ex-street dude who should stick to rapping and not theology. People be wildin', man. You can fool some people, but you're not going to fool the big dog, all right? Like and subscribe to the channel. Hope this was helpful. No, I'm not a Calvinist, but I am Reformed. I'm a biblicist. I believe what the Bible teaches. And I do not think that everyone who's not Reformed or a Calvinist is somehow not a Christian. I do think Calvinists are not Christians when you're constantly accusing and attacking people of the very thing that Paul corrected the Corinthians for. If I'm lying, I'm dying. Paul said it. Don't be mad at me. Be mad at Paul if you make it to heaven when you see him. I'm out. Ooh, comment section is popping right now. But this video is too long. I'll read these later. Actually, let me just peek real quick. Just a couple. There's a lot of comments there. It's too many comments. I got to go. I got a meeting with my assistant. Love y'all. Like and subscribe to the channel. If you don't love Jesus. Can't handle the truth. Kirk Kennedy. I'm out.